So as I'm saying, my name's Christina Chavarria, and I have worked at the Holocaust Museum here in Washington, D.C. for, it's going to be 14 years. Before that, I was in Houston for 7 years at the Holocaust Museum there. And before that, I was a high school English teacher for 9 years in El Paso, Texas, which is my hometown. And like I said, you know, we're on the border. You might be familiar with El Paso. Sadly, last year we had a horrible tragedy in El Paso that you might have heard about at a Walmart. There was a horrible mass shooting, and the people were targeted because they were Hispanic, they were Latinos, they were of Mexican descent, and what is very harmful that we see a lot in our country is this harmful language and this harmful idea that we've had for far too long, where we take people and we separate them, and we create this language of hatred and fear. And those language has consequences, because language can lead to behavior, it leads to ideas, and then ideas can lead to behavior. And behavior, as we know, it has consequences, whether it's good or bad. And that's something that we study about in the Holocaust. So I'm not comparing anything like what happened in my home city to the Holocaust, but what I'm doing is showing how things are connected. And so it's very careful what it is that we read, because you all are reading things faster than I ever got to when I was your age. I graduated from high school in 1987, so it's been 33 years since I've been in high school. And we didn't have the internet. We didn't have access to information. We used to watch the cable news channels that are still on, that run 24 hours, but we didn't have Twitter, we didn't have Instagram, we didn't have TikTok, we didn't have anything else, Snapchat, we didn't have any of those things. So we learned the news maybe about 10 or 15 minutes after it happened. Now you're learning it as it's happening. So you have a lot of power in the information that you choose to listen to, and that you choose to understand. So what I want to share with you today is some information about a wonderful man who impacted my life, who I'm very, very blessed to have known. And so this year for Hispanic Heritage Month, because I'm on the Hispanic Heritage Month Committee at the Holocaust Museum, and we're putting together programs for my colleagues so that they can learn more about our history and our heritage. This year's theme is to honor our past, but also to embrace our future, and to think about all the different people that we have living in the United States and what we all contribute. So working at the Holocaust Museum, I love it because I get to meet so many wonderful people. I get to meet a lot of Holocaust survivors and their families, and I get to work closely with teachers and students. And it's really helped me to understand history on a very personal level. This history that I first read about in books has really kind of come alive more for me by working at the museum. But what's really interesting about the museum is that we get to also learn about who the other victims were. Now, we know that in the Holocaust, the primary group of victims were the Jewish people in Europe. They were the primary target, in that the Nazis' belief was that they needed to either be driven out, and when no country would take them because of strict immigration policies, that it was okay to murder them. That's how they believed. So we look at the Jewish people of Europe as the primary victims, but there were other groups of people who were also victims of Nazi persecution too. It could be based on their religious beliefs. It could be based on their political beliefs. It could also be based on this idea that they were a different race. So we have a lot of different groups of victims that we look at as victims of Nazi persecution, in addition to the primary group. And so with that, we keep learning many things about people who were victims and who were sent to the Nazi concentration camps. And that's a story I'm going to share with you today. So what I'm going to do here is do a screen share with you. And I'm going to start the PowerPoint and share with you the story of this wonderful man who you see here when he was a young man and he entered the military. So the theme again is be proud of your past and embrace the future. So we have a collection, and what we mean by the word collection is artifacts, a group of belongings from somebody, and that person or his or her family gave the museum the belongings, because these belongings have something to do with this history during the Holocaust in the 1930s through 1945. So Anthony Acevedo gave us his collection. And we learned a lot about Mr. Acevedo because we took his testimony, we interviewed him, and I got to interview him in Spanish, so I felt very proud and I felt very close to him. I felt like he was the word in Spanish for uncle is tío, T-I-O, so he became kind of like my tío, like my uncle. And because I got to know him and his family and his story very well. So first, I want to talk to you about Latinos, Hispanic Americans in World War II. They served about 500,000 Hispanic Americans, Latino Americans, served in the military. They fought in the war. They supported the war effort. And they were very active and very courageous. And it wasn't only people of Mexican descent. It was people from Puerto Rico, from Central America, who now lived in the United States, were US citizens or working to become citizens, and they served our country very proudly and very bravely. In my family alone, my great uncles fought in the war, and I had a great uncle, my great uncle Ricardo, who died. He was taken prisoner by the Japanese, and he died in a Japanese prison. My grandmother worked in the munitions factories to help build materials and weapons to support our fighting in the war. So there were a lot of contributions. Over here on the left-hand side, you see this picture of one man and a lot of women. These were women from Puerto Rico who supported the war effort. Some of them went to Europe, and because of their strong Spanish skills, they were able to do a lot of translation, not only just to Spanish, but they were also able to read French and Italian because the languages are so similar, they're Romance languages. So we have to honor the fact that many Latinos, many Hispanic Americans served very bravely in the Second World War. Including Anthony Acevedo. So these are some pictures that Anthony Acevedo gave to us at the museum 10 years ago. In fact, in 2 days, it will be 10 years to the day that he came to the museum and gave us this treasure trove. So here you see him on the left-hand side. This is when he took an oath and he becomes a member of the military. You see him there. This is in California. He was born in California. I'll talk a little bit more about his background. And here he is on the right-hand side. He's second to the left. And he's in training to become a medic. So not only is he going to serve in the military and go abroad, but his specific role will also be to treat wounded American troops in the war. So how did we learn about his story? And there's always a story within a story, and that's one of the fascinating things. If you ever study history professionally, and even as you study history through high school and maybe through college and beyond, there are always stories behind the story, and that's one of the things that is really special about getting involved in history and learning history. So in 2008, a friend of mine who's a teacher who works closely in our teacher programs, he is a veteran, and he sent me a link. He emailed a link to me. He's like, hey, I've heard this story about this man, and I think you'd find it interesting because he has kind of a similar background like your family. And then I emailed one of my colleagues, one of my coworkers, and she had heard the story too. And her job is to work with people so that she gains their trust, so that they give us their photos, their letters from that time, their collections. So my colleague, Kira Schuster, wonderful, wonderful person, she found the family. She found Mr. Acevedo alive and well and living in California, in Southern California, because he was on CNN, which CNN, of course, is still around. CNN did a story on him, and this is a screenshot from the CNN story where he was talking about how he was born to Mexican parents who had come to live in the United States. He was born in the United States. He talked about the segregation that he experienced as a Mexican American in the United States. He couldn't go to the same school as children who were not Mexican. He couldn't swim in the neighborhood pool. He had to go to another pool. But at the same time, he was very patriotic and very devoted to being an American. What happened to him was his family was part of a program that happened in the 1930s where many Mexican nationals who were living in the US and Americans who were of Mexican descent who were born in the US, they were forced to go back to Mexico. It was called repatriation, but really it was a forced expulsion program. My great-grandparents were living in Arizona at the time, and they were almost forced to go back to Mexico. And they were lied to and said, well, you know, we need your jobs, so you need to go back to Mexico. It'll be a better life for you there. And they hadn't been in Mexico in years. And so what happened with Mr. Acevedo was when he was 13 years old, his family was deported to Mexico unlawfully because he is an American-born citizen. And he didn't know very much about Mexico at the time. He didn't really even speak a lot of Spanish at the time. But anyway, the CNN story talks about that. And then it talks about how he came back to the US because as an American-born citizen, he was required to enlist in the military. And then he was required and drafted into the Army. And we learned that when he was captured, that he kept a diary. So a lot of you might be familiar with the Diary of Anne Frank. That's probably the most famous diary of the Holocaust and probably one of the most famous diaries in the world. So at the museum, we collect diaries from other people. Anne Frank's diary is at the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, but we do collect other diaries. But we never had a diary of somebody who kept the diary while they were a prisoner. We have diaries of people who were in hiding, diaries of people who witnessed this, but we never had a diary of somebody in captivity. So this was really incredible to us. There were many layers to his story. So we reached out to him, and for 2 years, we went to visit him, visited his family. And so what happened was in 2019, and I'm in the picture there next to him, in 2010, he donated his collection to the museum. And so there he is, Mr. Acevedo in 2010. He's holding the diary in his hand. It's not a big diary. It's just over 60 pages. It's written in cursive, but it's very easy to read. He had very nice handwriting. He gave us this diary, and he also gave us letters and pictures and other artifacts like the cross that he made for himself, his prayer missal. He was a very devoted Catholic, and he tried to maintain his faith when he was a prisoner. So this is the diary that he gave to us. This is when we recorded his testimony. So I just want to share with you what he gave us. So here you see a letter that his father wrote. And his father wrote this letter from Durango, Mexico, from the town that they lived in after they were deported from California. But what he's saying here is, I give my son permission, and it's in English, and we have it on our website, and I can give you this PowerPoint. I'll give it to Ms. Walker so you can read the letter. This is a letter his father wrote saying, yes, I give my son permission to go back to the US and serve his country. And it's kind of ironic because they were deported, they were forced out of the United States, but yet he's still required to fight for the United States. And he did so without question, because he really loves his country. So here's a picture of him in training to be a medic. So what happens to Mr. Acevedo is he is sent to Europe. He's in training and he's sent to Europe. And this is a picture of him in Belgium. He fought in the Battle of the Bulge, which was one of the most famous and also one of the most, they were all tragic, but this had a very high death toll, the Battle of the Bulge in Belgium. He was captured during the Battle of the Bulge, and he was sent to a prisoner of war camp. And that's a common thing to happen in war. It's a tragic, but it is a very common thing to happen. So Mr. Acevedo is in a prisoner of war camp, and what happens is the war is almost over. This is the end of 1944, going into 1945. There are only a few months left, and Germany is clearly, it is losing the war, and yet Germany still made every effort to target Jews and other people and to persecute them and murder them. Even though they're losing the war, they're low on resources, they're low on money, they're still, because they have this vision of what they wanted the world to be like, they were still sending people to the concentration camps. And Anthony Acevedo and 349 other American prisoners of war were picked to go to a concentration camp now. A concentration camp called Berga in Germany, because they were in Belgium, but now they're being sent to Germany. And why were they picked? So these 350 men who were Americans who are now prisoners of war, the Germans, they're picked to go to a concentration camp because many of the men were Jewish, or they had Jewish sounding names, or because they looked like they were racially inferior. And it was probably because he was of Mexican descent that Mr. Acevedo was picked to go to Berga as now a prisoner in a concentration camp. So that's what makes his story intersect and be part of not just the general history of World War II, but because he goes to a concentration camp, that's very specific to the Holocaust. So this is how he is part of Holocaust history. So just if there are any questions about that, what makes this story different and why the Holocaust Museum wants to have his collection and learn from him is because of that. So as I mentioned, this is his diary. The diary was sent to him in a care package through the Red Cross. So prisoners were allowed, depending on where you were, prisoners were allowed in some cases and in some places, not all, to receive care packages. And he was given this care package that contained a diary and a pen. So he writes on the front of it, and the opening it up, he writes that this diary belongs to him, Anthony Acevedo. He's from Pasadena, California, even though he wasn't living there anymore. That's where he was born. So this is the diary that we have at the museum. And you can find these pictures on the internet, but like I said, I'm going to give this PowerPoint to Mrs. Walker so you all can look at it some more. So what he does, let me go back a slide, is he starts to write in his diary, nice cursive writing. If you read cursive, it's very easy to read. And he starts to talk about the day-to-day struggle of what they're going through. He doesn't go into a lot of graphic, awful detail, but a lot of horrible things happened to him in the camp. He was brutalized terribly. He was beaten, he was starved, and And at the same time, he's writing in his diary, kind of like what Anne Frank writes about, what we call spiritual resistance. He's trying to hold on to something within himself that keeps him feeling like a human being, something that keeps him going. He's not able to fight back physically because they're being brutalized. Of course, they're outnumbered. They don't have weapons. They're being starved. But he's fighting back in a way that keeps him human, that keeps him feeling positive in a way. He writes about trying to observe Good Friday. Like I said, he's a very devout Catholic, and Good Friday is, of course, one of the most sacred days in the Christian calendar. So he writes about how it's Good Friday. And what he also writes about is that his fellow prisoners of war who are Jewish, they're trying to observe Passover, because Passover and Easter and Good Friday, they all happen pretty much at the same time. And he's saying that, you know, they are trying to fast, but then he makes this ironic comment saying, well, we've really been fasting since we were captured, because they're being starved almost to death. But he also writes about how he's trying to think about his family back home in Durango, because remember, he's been living in Durango now for several years, and what they might be doing. What he also does with his diary is let me go back right here. He also draws a lot in his diary. He draws pictures of the cathedral from Durango, as he remembered it. He draws pictures of some of the architecture of some of the cities that he's seen in Europe. He also draws a lot of pictures of very pretty women. He writes about his girlfriend, what she might be doing, his feelings for her. He draws a picture of her, and then he draws a picture of the pinup of the American forces, the pinup of the year. So there used to be calendars that they would put together for the servicemen of really pretty women. And so he's trying to remember what these women look like, and so he draws them. So this is what we call spiritual resistance. It's a way that you fight back with your spirit, to do the things that keep you feeling human, to continue to learn, to document. So I think there's a slide that's missing here. I think, yes, this is a slide that was missing. What he also does in his diary is he lists the name of the service members, his fellow American prisoners of war, who he's taking care of, who he's trying to treat. Because remember, he's a medic, so he's trained to help with injuries, with illness. And what's so tragic is that many of these men literally die in his arms. He sees a lot of brutality. And so what he uses his diary for, as you can see on the left-hand side, he lists the names and the service number of each of the men who die, and he also writes down what they die of. And this is very helpful to us at the Holocaust Museum, because we were actually able to contact the family members of some of these young men who died decades ago in the Second World War, and they've given us things that belong to them. So his diary it's not only personal to him, but it can help us to understand a lot about this history and who the victims of Nazi persecution were. So he's given us a gift, really. And then you can see here in this illustration, the drawing that he's created from March of 1945. He's showing the slave labor that they're subjected to. And this is very important for his story decades later, because the reason why CNN did a story on Anthony Acevedo, and you can watch it, I'll send Mrs. Walker the link, and you can watch it and hear him speak, is because he and his fellow prisoners of war, those who survived, there were maybe like 90 of them who survived all of this, out of hundreds and thousands. The United States, they had to sign an agreement that they would never speak about how they were sent to a concentration camp. So for decades, a lot of these men started to die, and there were very few left, and he was one of them left. And finally, they were allowed to speak about it, but they were told not to speak about it, and they had to sign an affidavit saying they wouldn't speak about it, because at the end of the war and in the following years, Germany becomes our ally in the Cold War, our ally against what was then the Soviet Union. It doesn't exist anymore, but that was what Russia was part of. So he couldn't talk about this. And because he couldn't talk about it, he also couldn't be compensated for slave labor. And he also couldn't really speak about this or help others to learn about it because he had signed this and because of what happened with Germany now becoming an ally. So that's why his story was so important to us, because we learn even more about this history and the longer impact of it. So finally, his story came to be known to some of our elected leaders, his congressmen, senators in California where he lives, who bring him to Capitol Hill to be recognized and honored decades later, to be given the honor that they were denied. And he really went through a lot in his life because of that. Even when he came back and he was able to come back to California, and so was his family, because he had gone through all of this, he still had to fight against a lot of discrimination, and he did. And he was able to start to talk more about his life in World War II. He went on not to become a doctor, that was his first dream, but he went on to become an engineer, very successful. He was part of what we call the GI Forum that came out of World War II, where many Latinos who served in World War II came back to the United States and said, you know, we fought for this country. Why are we being denied rights? It was many Latinos who came back and said that, many African Americans who came back and said, look, we demand our rights. It was the start of the civil rights movement. And a lot of the veterans of World War II who were minorities came back and said, we've more than proven our patriotism and our allegiance to our country. So we demand the same rights. And he was part of that. And that's why his story just means so much to us to have it at the museum. So moving ahead here, he is finally liberated in April of 1945. And he's able to come back to the United States. He has to go to a hospital for a while. He's very weak, malnourished. He suffered a lot of physical scars, but he also had a lot of psychological scars. He did suffer from post-traumatic stress because of what happened to him, the way he was treated. But in the same time, he was able to marry, and he had 4 children. And he died, sadly, he died 2 years ago. I was able to talk to him over the phone about 2 weeks before he passed away. But I would go and visit him whenever I'd go to California. I'd go to his home, and he always called me mija, which is a term of endearment that my family has always used for me, my parents. So he was just such a wonderful human being and dear friend. And what I want to share with you is something that we've just started at the museum. It's another part of this history about history for those of us who are of Mexican descent, but even if you're not, this is history for everybody to learn. I mentioned how his family was sent to Mexico, how they were deported to Mexico. We've just started a project. We have a newspaper project, and hopefully you can help us with this newspaper project, where you get to research newspapers from the 1930s and 40s to help us find newspaper articles about what was happening in the United States and how United States newspapers were reporting on what's happening in Europe. And we just added this new module on the repatriation of Mexican Americans and Mexican nationals, because we want to find out what newspapers were reporting. And the reason why we're including this, because some of you might be asking, well, how is that related to the Holocaust? We have an exhibit right now. The museum is closed because of COVID, but we do have an exhibit right now, and we have it online, so you can go to our website. It's called Americans in the Holocaust. And we're using this exhibit to show what the mood was like in the United States. What was our attitude toward immigrants? What was our attitude toward immigration laws? What was our attitude toward going back to war after the First World War? What was our attitude during the Depression? What were some of the things that influenced the way we responded to the Jewish refugees who were trying to come here to the United States? And one of the ways to understand that is to look at how we treated minorities living in the United States who were American citizens, but because they're minorities, they experienced segregation. They were subject to Jim Crow laws, all kinds of racism, lynching. So we decided that we needed to also show not only what happened to Japanese Americans on the West Coast who were sent to internment camps, and to look at the way African Americans, Black Americans were treated. We also wanted to show now how Mexican Americans were treated in this country, and what they went through, and how all of this could influence how we looked at a minority group from Europe, and how we treated, how our quota system excluded them from coming here easily to the United States. It's not to say that we didn't take in refugees, because we did, but there was a lot of debate, and many people felt that bringing in refugees from another country would be harmful for us because we were going through a Great Depression and they would be an economic drain on the country, or that they might be spies and it would be a threat to our national security once the war began in 1939. So we want our audiences to get a bigger picture of some of the obstacles for European Jews to come to the United States by looking at some of our attitudes. But that's also not to say that everybody had those attitudes. There were, just like today, there were great Americans who did things to help refugees, to help minorities. And there were many advances that were made in this time. So I hope that you can take part in this History Unfolded project, where you can go to this website and you can create a free account. It's all free. And you can help us to find newspaper articles, not only on the repatriation of Mexican Americans and Mexican nationals, which is part of Mr. Acevedo's story, but also about how the newspapers were reporting on the Olympics of 1936, how newspapers were reporting on Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass in November 1938. There are a lot of topics that we give you, and what we're saying is these are some topics we need help with, for you to help us by finding newspaper articles on all of these topics, because that's going to help historians when they come to the museum to see all of these articles. A lot of students have gotten involved in this project, and it's also taught us at the museum things that we never knew about different cities and states in the United States, and how some of them did some really incredible things to aid refugees that we had no idea about if these students had not if they had not found these articles and sent them to us. So if you have any questions, this is my email address. And the phone number isn't working right now because we're not in the office, but I hope that you will learn more about Mr. Acevedo. I will send Mrs. Walker some more links for you to go on to the internet and do some more research and reading about him. And some other people who I think are also pretty incredible. So I just want to thank you all for listening. And if we have any questions or comments, I'm happy to take them.